Welcome back to the Vixen Victory channel. Today we're going to be talking about Cyno. We've already gone through our other character guides talking about the other characters. We've made our way all the way over to Cyno, so let's go ahead and jump into his talent priority. When looking at his talent priority, there's multiple things that you kind of need to focus on and which one you want to focus on leveling. And it kind of does depend on really what you want out of him. So as you can see, his burst is a little bit more focused on increasing his specific damage that you can get with doing your normal attacks and everything because of an infusion that you can get. The same thing can be said though about his skill because of the amounts of damage and whatnot that you can get through the skill usages as well, because how the burst will change these skills over to a different type of damage as well. So not only that, do you want to level into the burst for the actual just straight up damage that you're mainly going to be doing with him, but also you want to keep in mind the actual damage increases that the skill will give you while also in that state. So technically you don't have to focus on too much else besides necessarily the skill and the burst. You can level into all three if you so desire, but really honestly my main way to focus on anything obviously would be the burst first, then looking at the skills as well afterwards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into his burst, considering this is where you kind of want to start, and then we'll talk about his skill and how that changes things as well. So using the burst, basically he's going to jump into the Pack-Sworn Path Clearer state, and at this point in time, Cyno's normal, charged, and plunging attacks will be then converted into electro damage, and this electro infusion cannot be overridden. Cyno's elemental mastery and his resistance to interruption will increase as well, and then he will gain immunity to electrocharge damage, so he won't basically get stun locked consistently if he's doing some electrocharge damage or he's fighting, hydro enemies. He won't get constantly zapped away from, doing constant combos. At this time, then you will also be able to get rid of, if you swap off of him and switch to a different character, the Pack-Sworn Path Clearer will end. So obviously that'll also make sense, but also this state only lasts for 18 seconds. So the base duration is at 10 seconds, and once again, there's an increase that you can get basically to increase the time that he's in it. That's why there's a maximum of 18 seconds here, which that's probably what we're going to get to in the passive talents. But looking at the skill, he performs a swift thrust, dealing electro damage to opponents along the path that he has. It's kind of like what you see in Zhao's skill, just a quick dash towards an enemy. When Cyno's in and under the Pack-Sworn Path Clearer state, so when he's basically in the burst usage, and he triggers his skill, he will then instead unleash a Mortuary Rite that deals thunderous AoE electro damage and extends the duration of the Pack-Sworn Path Clearer. So the idea here is that while you're basically in here without the burst, you're only doing at level 1 130% damage, but when you're actually in the burst, you're getting an extra 37% damage increase. And as levels get higher and higher, I believe this damage difference kind of expands even more, meaning that Mortuary Rite damage is far more worth it to use when you're actually in the burst, obviously. Not only because of the extra damage increase that you can get here, but also because you're increasing the time that you're in your burst state. So as you can see here, when you use the skill inside his, obviously his in general regular burst state, then you're going to be, when you use the skill, the Mortuary Rite specifically, then it's going to each time give you a 4-second increase. Now, if you remember, there is a 10-second basic duration, so the base duration of the burst is 10 seconds if you don't use any skill usages at all. But if you do a skill usage, it'll bring it up to 14 seconds because it's +4. Now, if you do another skill usage after that, it's 18. And remember that the maximum you can get is 18 seconds. So technically, with his burst, you really only need to do 2 skill usages. But because the amount of damage that he can get from these skills, it's honestly best to use the Mortuary Rite damage as consistently as you can get it and use it, as well as when the eye kind of pops up on his screen, which we're actually going to talk about in one of his passive states. Looking at that passive talent, it states that when Cyno is in the Pack-Sworn Path Clearer state in his burst, Cyno will enter the End-Seer stance at certain intervals. If he activates basically his skill while affected by this stance, and what that stance is basically like almost like an eye that you can kind of see, and almost basically like this, and it's like almost the entirety of the screen kind of pops up here, and it's a little bit just pops up a little bit more for you, and it's very easy to see, but it basically takes up like half the screen in the middle here. And as soon as you then use the skill when that pops up, while affected by this stance, he will activate the Judication effect, increasing the damage of his skill hit by 35%. So we already know that while he's in the burst, it's already higher than the, let's say at level 1, it's 130%. When he's in his burst, it's now almost 160%. And then he gets a 35 damage percent increase on top of that when he waits for that eye to pop up to use the skill. He will also fire off 3 Duststalker bolts that deal 100% of Cyno's attack as electro damage. And remember that these certain types of bolts are considered elemental skill damage. So if you're looking for more damage per se from everything from him, getting some extra skill buffs from other characters or from sets or whatever, it's going to be useful for him as well. Now, the major way is basically to be consistently using normal attacks with him, and then as soon as, once again, that eye pops up, using the skill. So even though you can't increase the burst longer than the 18 seconds, and technically you only need to use it twice, using it constantly and more often because of this huge damage buff you get is obviously going to be way better, as well as the normal damage buff from using it inside the burst anyways. Looking at the second passive talent, Cyno's damage values will be increased based on his elemental mastery. And this is also why he does extremely well. Mainly you saw everything kind of being based off of just straight up attack percent in his normal kit, but if you've noticed how a lot of people play Cynos, it's based off of elemental mastery. And that's not like a character like Chlorond or whatever or Catching, where they don't actually have any elemental mastery in their kit to give them a buff. It's just kind of there because it's a good idea, and you can give someone like Nahida and just kind of force feed them some elemental mastery to make some really good aggravate hits, whereas he actually gets, as well as all that damage buff that it is nice from Nahida, he also has an actual reason to basically go into elemental mastery as well. Looking at the passive talent though, it states that the Pack Swarm Path Clearer's normal attack damage is increased by 150% of his elemental mastery, which is why you should be going into it, as well as giving other characters more elemental mastery to him. The Duststalker bolt damage that you get from the passive talent that we just looked at is also increased by 250% of his elemental mastery. So not only his normal attacks, his skills are also getting a huge buff by just being a part of the burst, and then also this passive talent here giving another buff to those hits, but also his normal attacks are getting a huge buff, as well as the Duststalker bolts from the actual other passive talent that you already have. So everything works together extremely well here, which is why elemental mastery is a big friend to him. Now, let's go ahead and look at some weapons when we're going to be talking about someone like him, because honestly, with him, he's got a lot of options actually when looking at weapons on what he can use. So I think there's two major ways when we need to look at Cyno when looking at weapons, and the first way is whether or not you're trying to do a Hyperbloom team, which is going way more into kind of like the idea of just going full-blown into a higher amount of elemental mastery, and then also the way of going for more aggravate, which is based off of attack a little bit more than the Hyperbloom, obviously. So with those two different builds, there's kind of two major ways. I think if you follow the aggravate way, your Hyperbloom damage is still going to be good. So I think I'm going to give you guys the major reasons of going for the aggravate DPS and kind of going that route rather than the Hyperbloom route. I'll throw in some extra weapons or whatever from that route as well, but they kind of are similar. They just kind of move around the best weapons for him around a little bit more. Now, his best weapon obviously is going to be his personal weapon, Staff of the Scarlet Sands. Crit rate main stat, very, very good. It's a little bit of a high crit rate actually, which is actually very nice because having a good crit ratio for this, because he has to go into attack as well as an elemental mastery. So he's got to go for attack, elemental mastery, both types of crit. So there's a lot to go after. So to see a high amount of crit rate in the weapon is actually very useful for him. Obviously, we're not going to talk about the weapon too much because obviously it's going to be his best weapon, whether or not you go aggravate or Hyperbloom. His second best weapon is actually another weapon that Zhao's weapon, Primordial Jadewing Spear. Now, although this has like half the amount of crit rate that you get from his personal weapon, the base attack is extremely high, and then on hit, he also gets even more stacks of attack, which means that you can stack this even higher and higher, meaning that you can go full blown for more elemental mastery and focus on crit in the actual, substats and main stats of your artifacts rather than the weapon, and you don't have to worry about attack as much because of this specific weapon. It allows you to kind of not have to worry about anything that has to do with attack in your actual stats and kind of let this weapon carry that part of your build. The third weapon I want to bring up, we're going to skip the 4 stars for a quick second, is the White Tassel. Now, I know you might be saying, what in the world are you talking about? Why are you bringing up a 3-star weapon? Well, at level 90, even though it only has 400 base attack, the crit rate that it gives as a main stat is 23.4%, which is more than you get in Primordial Jadewing Spear. Now, although you don't get a huge buff to attack like Primordial and the higher base attack and everything, at R5, because this is a 3-star weapon, you should be able to find, if you have at least one, even at R1, it's a 24% normal attack damage increase. And as we saw, normal attacks are going to be a big part of his kit as well as his skill usages. So getting this extra buff is really good. Never mind if you have the weapon at R5, it goes from a 24% damage increase to your normal attacks to 48%. easily doubling it. And seeing how easy it is to get 3-star weapons, this weapon could actually be R5 very easily when you actually are going for weapons and you're building something soon. Even going for characters, it'd probably be very easy to find this weapon and use it. So if you guys want to use that, you can. Now, going for a little bit of a different route in terms of kind of pay, which is not really free to play, is Ballad of the Fjords. This you have to get by getting the battle pass. And I know I kind of always talk about Ballad of the Fjords and Deathmatch being some of the best weapons, but because honestly, polearm characters really do better with these actual weapons. There are other weapons kind of categories that the weapon types like other, swords and whatnots. Yes, the, battle pass weapons are good, but there are a lot of better options sometimes in other areas. In my personal opinion, though, with polearms, they did so well on the battle pass options, and that's why I constantly bring them up. But Ballad of the Fjords, in my personal opinion, is probably going to be better than something like Deathmatch. Although Deathmatch increases a lot of attack way easily, they both have the main stats at kind of the same, so there's really no real reason to kind of go for one or the other for that reason. But the reason why Ballad of the Fjords is better is because when there are at least 3 different elemental types in the party, you get an extra increase of elemental mastery at 120, and that's just at R1. Now, if you can go and get this obviously to R5, you can get 240 elemental mastery increase. And that's why this weapon I wanted to throw in was mainly for those people that are going to be doing the Hyperbloom teams, because you're going to need Electro. He's going to be the Electro character. You need a Hydro and you need a Dendro character with a flex slot of one of the 3 elements. And that's already 3 different types of elements in a party, so this is a very good weapon actually for a Hyperbloom look at him. But even still, beyond Hyperbloom, this weapon is still extremely good and can be very good if you're just kind of throwing a bunch of elements together in a team, and it makes them a lot easier to actually do lots of damage. So even still, in an aggravate team, this can be better. I do think maybe Deathmatch kind of ekes it out just a little bit more if, you're an aggravate team rather than Ballad of the Fjords, because usually with aggravate teams, you're doing double Electro and double Dendro, which means there's only 2 elements in the team. So it's a little bit more difficult to grasp the 120 elemental mastery at the end of the day, but it's still actually a very good weapon either way that you go about it. You just really won't be able to get the ability through this. Still, the crit rate and the base tech are extremely good on this weapon. The craftable weapon, Katane Cross Spear, is also a good weapon, which I'm going to bring up mainly specifically. You can use it for the actual aggravate team, because once again, elemental mastery still does help aggravate, so keep that in mind, as well as his passive talent increases more damage based off of his elemental mastery, but also the ability increases his elemental skill damage by a certain percentage as well. And in my personal opinion, that's just really, really good for him as a character, because elemental skill damage, we already know, gets a lot of buffs in his kit, so helping more with that is very good. This is a weapon, though, that's probably a little bit more tailored to the Hyperbloom team because of the high amount of elemental mastery that you can get from it. It's about 110 as a weapon, which is, not as big as other weapons in other categories or even as a main stat on an artifact, but honestly, still, getting this weapon could be extremely good even for those aggravate teams as well. Now I want to go ahead and talk about artifacts. When looking at artifacts with him, it's a little bit weird because a lot of people are going to do things very differently. There's the 2 major 4-piece sets that you're actually going to run, rather than an actual 1 set that I originally thought was made for him a little bit more than some of the others, or maybe kind of made for a similar idea for him as a character, which I originally thought Golden Dreams was one of his best sets, which it is a very good set, don't get me wrong for that, but I do think that he actually has some other sets that work out a little bit better. Going back in time actually to the 4-piece Thundering Fury. Personally, between this set and Gladiator's Finale, the 2 quote-unquote best sets for him, I actually like Thundering Fury a little bit more. Now that's personal, that's not necessarily this is going to do better for you than this other set here on the Gladiator's Finale. At the end of the day, if you have these 2 sets, I have 50 pieces of Glad. Honestly, it'd be better for me to probably run a 4-piece Gladiator's Finale because I have more pieces and I'll probably have better stats on this 4-piece than I'll have in Thundering Fury. So at the end of the day, once again, if you're trying to choose between the 2, just look for the one that gives you the better stats. And, good crit ratio, a good amount of elemental mastery, as well as a good amount of attack as well. So that's what really matters. But either way, looking at the 4-piece of Thundering Fury, the 2-piece gives you an electro damage bonus, which is helping all types of damage that he does. Also increases his overloaded, electrocharge, superconduct, and hyperbloom damage, which is going to be big for those hyperbloom teams because that still helps hyperbloom in this specific team. So either way you go is going to help. Also because the damage bonus conferred by aggravate is increased by 20% as well. And then when Quicken or an aforementioned elemental reaction is triggered, elemental skill cooldown is decreased by 1 second and can only occur once every 0.8 seconds. This is another reason why people like to use this set on him, because it's giving his skill back a little bit quicker, which is going to help him, once again, be making sure that he's always ready for those eyes to pop up, but also could allow sometimes even more time to use more of his skill usages more consistently. So in my personal opinion, I do think that Thundering Fury ekes out Glad a little bit, but that doesn't necessarily mean to take anything away from Gladiator's finale. With a 2-piece going into attack percent, also with the 4-piece, it states that if the wielder of this artifact set uses a sword, claymore, or polearm, which he does, it increases their normal attack damage by 35%. So whereas in Thundering Fury, you're kind of helping all types of damage, specifically also the aggravate and the hyper blooms that he'll be doing on either types of teams, that's going to be kind of the major way, especially if you're going Hyper Bloom. I would go for Thundering Fury over Glad. And then if you're actually saying, well, you know, I just have the Aggravate team and I have this set, this technically Thundering Fury also does extremely well because of the buff here, giving some skill, cooldown, you know, decreasing, which is helping you get that back more. The electro damage bonus is helping all types of damage you're doing. But really the only buff that Glad is giving here, and that's not necessarily taking away from the 35% normal attack damage increase that it gives, that's very good. It's either allowing with Glad his normal attacks to do more damage, or if you're looking towards Thundering Fury, it's technically helping the Hyper Blooms. If you're in the Hyper Bloom team, this is definitely the better set to go. Or it's looking at just the aggravate all types of damage that you're doing, skills and normal attacks combined, all of that's getting an increase. So it really just depends on which one you like more, and in my personal opinion, I really do think, honestly, it really depends more on, do you have, you know, better stats on Thundering Fury, or do you have better stats on Glad? Now, you can, I also did talk about the 4-piece of Gilded Dreams, you can use this set as well. It's probably not going to do as well as Thundering Fury and Glad, but you can go for it as well if you technically, once again, do have better stats on this set than the others. The 2-piece increases elemental mastery by 80, and the 4-piece states that within 8 seconds of triggering an elemental reaction, which he's going to do pretty consistently on the Aggravate team or in the Hyper Bloom team, the character equipping this set will obtain buffs based on the elemental type of the other party members in the team. Attack is increased by 14% for each party member whose elemental type is the same as the equipping character, which if you're in an Aggravate team is probably going to be one more Electro character, which you're getting a 14% attack buff. But if you're in a Hyper Bloom team, he's probably the only one that's the Electro character. And so this set doesn't really, in my personal opinion, do as well. And this is possibly why the attack percent is actually pretty good as well. This set could be really good for that Hyper Bloom team because the attack increase is going to help only with him, whereas with Hyper Bloom, it's only based on elemental mastery and the level of the character, which is why he's going to be the only Electro character, so he's not going to get the 14% attack buff. But in Hyper Bloom teams, he's going to have 3 other characters that are going to give him 50 elemental mastery for every party member with a different elemental type. So the 3 other characters in the team that aren't Electro are going to give him 150 elemental mastery combined, which is why usually if you're going to run a, Hyper Bloom team, it's between, in my personal opinion, once again, Thundering Fury and Gilded, with Gilded giving you 150 in the 4-piece and 80 in the 2-piece, which is why Gilded is still up there for one of the usages for his 4-piece sets. Gladiators and Thundering Fury, that's really what you're looking for on the main side, and then if you do not really want to use those two, you can go for Gilded Dreams, especially if you are Hyper Bloom team focused as well. With the Aggravate team, you're getting at least most likely one other Electro character, which means you're probably getting the attack increase of 14%, and you probably have Double Dendro, which is giving you 250s or 100 elemental mastery, so 180 from the entire 2-piece and 4-piece set with a 14% attack as well. Now, the other idea that I do want to take a look at is actually main stats on these sets. Now, with talking about main stats on him, the biggest thing you want to focus on is most likely elemental mastery on the sands. Now, if you have an elemental mastery weapon, you could go for an attack percent sands, but I still would argue for a elemental mastery sands just because of the buffs that you can get, especially if you are going for a different type of team as well. But for Aggravate teams, you're going to want to go for an elemental mastery sands, an electro damage bonus goblet, and a crit rate or crit damage circlet. Especially if you have his weapon, you'll probably go for a crit damage circlet, so he's kind of a little bit easy to build in that sense, where you can kind of bank on a lot of the elemental mastery coming out of his sands, but that's mainly for the aggravate team that he's actually going to be working on. But once again, I did talk about throughout this entire video that he can work on a Hyperbloom team as well. And that's why Thundering Fury is going to be an extremely good set, and Gilded Dreams as well can be another great set for him. But when we're looking at main stats here, his Sands is going to need to be Elemental Mastery. His Goblet is going to need to be Elemental Mastery, and you can try to push for an Electro Damage bonus, Goblet as well. That's wouldn't really be too bad, but I would say that maybe getting some extra Elemental Mastery, especially if you have a crit weapon, going double Elemental Mastery on the Sands and Goblet is going to be a good idea. And then looking at your Circlet, you're still going to want to go either crit for more personal damage because you've gone for an Electro Damage bonus, basically Goblet. Or you can just go straight up. You could just go 3 Elemental Mastery main stats as well, if you're just trying to get the highest Hyperbloom numbers possible. Just keep in mind that his initial damage that he's doing consistently is not going to be as good, but his Hyperbloom numbers are going to be really good. So it's basically finding either the equilibrium between having good personal damage and good Hyperbloom damage, or being like Kuki, which is a character who just goes full-blown into Elemental Mastery all the way across, which you can do with your Cyno as well. So once again, it just depends on really what you want from him. Seeing a lot of people go, even still with a Hyperbloom team, it allows you kind of the normal way through the Aggravate team, going Elemental Mastery, Electro Damage bonus, and a crit rate, crit damage, because even if you do a Hyperbloom team, you're still getting pretty good Hyperblooms, but you still also have really good personal damage as well. And other people like to just go for only Hyperbloom team, and they've only built him for that, and they go full-blown into Elemental Mastery on all 3 of these main stats, and that's the only thing they really care about, which once again is fair. Now, looking at these substats though, I do want to talk about the substats you're going to want to focus on for both of the builds. You do want to have a good amount of energy recharge. The reason why is because when we're looking at him as a character, you do want to make sure obviously how integral, and you can see how integral his burst is to his kit. So keeping in mind that with his burst, if we take a look at his skill attributes, the actual energy cost is 80, which is a very high energy cost for a character. Now, he's in his burst for a very long time, and if you're doing double Electro, you really shouldn't have a problem getting his energy back at 80, mainly because of the Electro resonance. But still, as a character, you want to make sure that you still have a pretty good amount of energy recharge, like 140 to 160 possibly, to make sure that you're getting your burst back on rotation, because without his burst, he basically loses out on so much damage. So obviously, personal damage, as well as if you're looking for Hyperblooms, he's not going to be able to Hyperbloom with physical hits, so then the burst is the only way he can really do that, besides just using his skill outside of it, which you're not going to want to do. For the Aggravate team, you're going to want to take the Energy Recharge and Elemental Mastery as well as extra substats to find, but also finding double crit as well as attack percent on your pieces as well is going to be helpful for that team, whereas Hyperbloom doesn't need the crit rate, crit damage, or attack percent really at all. Once again, you can still go for the crit rate, crit damage, and the attack percent to maybe help his personal damage be a little bit better, but if you're going full-blown into Hyperbloom and don't care about anything else, then you can just only focus on Elemental Mastery. Now let's go ahead and take a look at his constellations. Looking at the first constellation, it states that after using his burst, Cyno's normal attack speed will be increased by 20% for 10 seconds, which is about half of the duration of his burst. If the Judication effect of his passive talent, Featherfall Judgment, is triggered during the skill usage, the duration of this increase will be refreshed, which means it goes from 10 seconds to it gets reset actually when you do it, which means that you can easily get it to go for the entire time that he has his burst up at the maximum of 18 seconds. You can also get the normal attack speed increase for the entirety of that time as well. So this is very helpful because it's giving out more personal damage by not even just hitting numbers. This isn't a damage increase at all. It's just helping his DPS, or damage per second. It's just increasing the amount of times he can hit more often. So the C1 is still pretty good. The C2 states that when Cyno's normal attacks hit opponents, his electro damage bonus will be increased by 10% for 4 seconds, and this effect can be triggered once every 0.1 seconds. And with how many times he's going to be hitting, that's going to be very nice, with a maximum of 5 stacks. That's 50% electro damage bonus, which if you have the C2, you might even look at kind of removing your electro damage bonus goblet and either going for more attack percent, going for more elemental mastery, or you can even keep the electro damage bonus to try to see what works best. But honestly, this C2 allows you to play around with your build a little bit more. Looking at his C3, it increases the level of his burst by 3, and the C5 increases the level of the skill by 3. Looking at the C4, it states that when Cyno is in the Pack Sworn Path Clear state, triggered by his burst, after he triggers Electrocharge, Superconduct, Overload, Quicken, Aggravate, Hyperbloom, basically any Electro type of reaction, he will restore 3 elemental energy for all nearby party members except himself. Now, this is going to be very useful once again because this is helping just energy for the entire party. If you're running double electro, you probably don't have problems with energy, so this constellation kind of goes out the window. But if you're running hyperbloom teams and trying to make sure that Yelan or Xingqiu or all these other characters that are very, need a lot of energy recharge already in their kits, and their bursts are very necessary for them as well, getting this extra elemental energy for the entire party is still very helpful and allows to make sure that no matter what, even through the abyss and bad rotations, you're always going to have your burst ready for your entire party, and then Cyno can basically take care of himself through what he can do already. Now looking at his C6, it states that after using his burst or triggering the adjudication effect on the passive talent that he has, Cyno will gain 4 stacks of Day of the Jackal effect. And this effect states that when he hits opponents with normal attacks, he will consume one of those stacks and fire off 1 Duststalker bolt. The Day of the Jackal lasts for 8 seconds and has a max of 8 stacks. It will be cancelled once Paxworn Path Clear ends, and a maximum of 1 Duststalker bolt can be unleashed this way every 0.4 seconds. So you can fire off and basically use up 4 of those stacks that you get basically, and then as soon as you do that, you get Day of the Jackal. At that point in time, that has max of 8 stacks though. So if you basically are going to do this huge hit, once again, remember that this skill hit can happen multiple times inside the burst. And by doing these multiple, stacks in the burst, you're also getting multiple of these stacks for Day of the Jackal, which means more of the Duststalker bolts getting thrown out every single time you do a normal attack, which is just heavily increasing the amount of numbers that you see on the screen, which means that it's going to be for faster and quicker clears. This basically takes him to the next level of just doing more and more damage outside of his initial damage. We don't see a lot of buffing from a lot of his constellations, except for, his first 2 really. And these are just kind of helping the mechanics, basically. His C1 and his C6, it's just helping a lot of the mechanics to increase a lot of the extra damage he outputs. The C2 is really the only one that actually gives him a stat buff, if you will. So with Cyno, it's very cool to see actually how his entire kit changes throughout the entirety of his constellations. Usually with other characters, we start to see them just basically get like a crit rate or crit damages buff, or something with, once again, kind of like his C2, giving some, electro damage bonus or elemental damage bonus, some resistance to the, decreasing on the enemy. But for him, it totally changes how his entire thing works, or maybe doesn't change how it works, but basically just makes it work better. His C1's just allowing for those faster attacks to allow for more damage per second, and then obviously here it's helping even more damage per second by doing the normal attacks. It's firing off even more types of damage outside of it. So even still, you can see a lot that happens throughout his entirety of his constellations. In my personal opinion, if you're going for constellations on Cyno, I know a lot of people kind of sit with him at C0, and honestly, I think that's pretty good. He's already a pretty good character at C0. I don't think that any of his constellations are necessary, to be honest with you, but I do feel like his C1, in my personal opinion, does better than his C2. Although this is a great electro damage bonus buff and there's a lot you can get from it, I'm just not really sure if it's worth 180 extra pulls after the C1 to really go for, whereas I feel like the extra speed increase is actually a little bit more worth it, in my personal opinion, for this. When looking at the teams that you're going to want to build for him, I'm just going to use catching in the instance for him, and because catching, like I stated kind of at the beginning of the video, is very similar to actually what you would do with him, because she can work on a lot of Hyperbloom teams as well as Aggravate teams as well. The teams that basically the best team that you're going to find for Cyno is going to be putting in Nahida in your second slot, or basically having Nahida in the team, then throwing in another Electro character that's basically helping. Once again, this is more of the Aggravate team, finding another Electro character that's going to help either with personal damage, characters like Yaimiko or Fischl or something like that, that'll help with their own personal damage. You could even throw in someone like Beto, who's going to maybe protect you a little bit more and put up a shield, so that could also be useful for you, and she does even do some hits as well while she's in her burst based on constellations. And then also you could do someone like Kujo Sara to buff a lot more of the attack or whatever of the character, of Cyno specifically. So you could even get a lot from, and if you have the C6, you're helping electro damage bonus as well. There's a lot of electro characters that you can use to actually help you out here. And if you want, you could even throw in someone like Kazuha, who's going to give you a little bit more of an edge on just basically helping give you a resistance shred basically from the Viridescent, as well as giving you an elemental damage bonus. And if you even want to use someone like Venti or something like that, Jean, who's a healer who can also use Viridescent, Sucrose, who can give some elemental mastery and do Viridescent. A lot of the Anemo characters can be used with this team as well. So keep that in mind if you're kind of looking for the other Electro character. I'm basically, if I was going to use this team, probably would throw in Kazuha just because of the amount of buffs and everything that he can give. Once again, I already stated you want to throw in another, obviously Nahida as the other character in the team. And the reason why Nahida is, I'm just going to throw in someone like Kale because I don't have Nahida. But if you have, Nahida here, she's going to be great. She gives elemental mastery to the character who's in the Shrine of Maya, which at this point in time should be Cyno. She's going to help him give more elemental mastery, which is helping his damage as well as never mind the aggravate, but also from the passive talent he has. And then obviously you need to find a healer, so someone like Baiju is a great one. That's probably the best team that you can have, in my personal opinion. And even if you want to switch away from someone like Kazuha, you can throw in a personal character like Yaimiko or Fischl to give you a little bit more of a personal damage buff from them. But even still, when running this team, that's kind of what you're looking for. Now, if you're looking more for the Hyper Bloom route, that changes things just a little bit. Now, usually with all the normal attacks he's doing, someone like Yelan or even someone like Xingqiu could be a great Hydro Applier because of how well they do it. But with the recent Farina idea with running him here, Farina could also be very good because she's increasing all types of damage. So those Hyper Bloom numbers that he's going to be doing are going to be buffed as well. But even if you're running that team specifically and you're looking for other characters, you're still going to need with Farina's kind of constant HP drain, you're going to need someone like Baiju or Yao Yao to make sure that you're getting healed, and then throwing in quote unquote, Nahida here, or Maikale. You're going to use Nahida and the team, once again, the same reason for the aggravate to buff the team. If you want to switch around characters though, let's go back to the aggravate team. You could still use plenty of different characters. And I know I did throw in Kale here as kind of a joke thing to just kind of be like the idea of this would be where you want to put Nahida, but Kale could still be a very good Dendro applier for the aggravate team. Same thing could be said about the Dendro main character. Someone like Yao Yao, who's a very good healer and a backup to what you find in Baiju, is another great character. I already talked about Fischl as well as some other characters you could use as supports for the Electro slot as well. But going over to the Hyper Bloom side, going away from probably one of the better teams that you can get with Farina buff, the Baiju healing, as well as the Nahida buff, the idea with that team, though, is that you actually could change even up a little bit. Once again, I talked about Yelan and Xingqiu being characters you could switch out for Farina. But if you're thinking, okay, well, I do that, and then what about, I don't have Farina, so I did that. Or, okay, well, I don't have Baiju, who could I use? The best slot that you're going to find is probably someone like Yao Yao. She's a good healer as well as good Dendro application. And with the anniversary coming up, we'll probably hopefully get a free 4-star in the future as well. So hopefully maybe we can get another one like that, or maybe in the Lantern Ride or something like that, you can go ahead and pick up a Yao Yao as well for your Cyno team. Now, alongside of this, you could even throw in another, once again, these other characters I was talking about, those Hydro characters, Dendro characters. Dendro main character is another great one I already talked about with the other team. You could even throw in another character like even Kirara with some shields even a little bit because of maybe just some extra application for Dendro or maybe some shielding that you want for your Cyno for some reason. So there's plenty of different needs to go for. Honestly, with both these teams though, you're going to want double Dendro though, so keep that in mind when you're running this because of the elemental mastery that you can get from the two of the characters that are from Dendro. Now the other team kind of helps with double Electro, which is going to help a little bit more with getting your energy back a little bit more often. So anytime you're doing basically an Electro reaction, you're going to have 100% chance to generate an Electro particle. Anyways, that's the idea when you're kind of looking forward to the teams here. I do think that there are some really good teams to make out of Cyno. I know a lot of people have kind of felt like over time, especially with Catching kind of jumping into the fray, she's not as good as him, but it's still a very good usage for him. So possibly in the future, when you're grabbing a character, if you don't even have Cyno, technically you could use Catching, especially as considering she's going to be a free 5-star in the future anyways, as a character that you can pull from the actual anniversary event we're getting soon. So another great character you could even use in place of Cyno right now. But yeah, these are some of the best teams that you can find for Cyno, so go ahead and try these out if you're doing so. Well, that's everything I've got talking about Cyno and kind of his teams as well as his tips, kind of how you want to play him. Once again, I know there's two major ways to play him. Usually the more flexible way is to just go for the aggravate route that I talked about, going for a little bit of elemental mastery, but mainly helping his personal damage. That build can still really work out on a Hyperbloom team. So even if you're doing that, that just means the Hyperbloom numbers aren't going to be as big, but because of the amount of damage he's personally putting out, it still works out wonders anyways. So once again, with all that out of the way, that's everything I've got talking about Cyno. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please go ahead and like and subscribe. And thank you guys once again for watching the video. I'll see you guys in the next one.